In this video, we're going to talk about Greek sculpture in the Classical Age. As we discussed a little bit in the Archaic Age, Greek sculpture was already becoming more realistic and humanistic in comparison with the more stiff human sculptures from the East in places like Egypt. We can see this when we look at the first slide here and this image of a sculpture that's known as the Critias Boy from around 480, so right around the time of Thermopylae and the Persian Wars. You can see that the whole figure is much more flexible and fluid and realistic and relaxed than the stiffness that we associate with Middle East sculptures. And you can see this in the other images on the slide as well. We're going to move through a number of slides quite quickly in this video. So the next slide, we're going to look at depictions of the gods. So the gods are being depicted as realistic humans, but also in their perfect form. So you could say this is the beginning of airbrushing. It starts with the Greek gods. And Greeks still want to portray them as realistic humans, but as the most perfect humans possible. And so we can see this in this image of Apollo that's calm, confident, beautiful. We move on to the next slide and we look at later sculptors, the work of later sculptors like Polycletus and Myron. We can see the role of mathematics in shaping Greek sculpture. That these sculptors are trying to convey beauty using mathematical proportions, just as we saw with architecture and with the Parthenon. And we can also see these images of growing interest in depicting the feminine form as well. After the Peloponnesian War, so beginning around the year 400 and moving forward into the time of Alexander the Great, we're going to see less interest in depicting gods and goddesses and more of an interest in depicting ordinary, intimate human beings. And this is something that we're going to talk about in the weeks ahead, how the Greek culture during the time of Alexander the Great becomes much less focused on the idea of the polis and the idea of community that we've talked a lot about up until now, but much more focused on the experiences of the individual. And we see this with the tombstone of Dixelius Authoricus. So we see him depicted as a warrior, which he was, but there's something about his posture, something about the way he's being portrayed here that doesn't show him as sort of the heroic Hector or Achilles defending Troy or defending his people. Instead, he seems somewhat disinterested, even self-absorbed. And then we also have this sculpture by Scopas showing the Bacchantes. From the Bacchae play that those of you who took Western Civ 1 with me will remember. And so again, it's about human passion, individual human passions at their most intense. We see this moving forward even in the sculptures of the gods. So this is, on the next slide, a sculpture of the god Apollo teasing a lizard. So this is the god in a more relaxed and playful, even trivial mode or mood, rather than the sort of terrifying god that we looked at earlier. So these are some of the changes, some of the more individualistic culture that we see emerging during the time of Alexander the Great that's being reflected in Greek art here. Lysippus, whose work we see here, was the most famous sculptor in the service of Alexander the Great, and Alexander only allowed Lysippus to sculpt him. And so with Lysippus, we see the development of new mathematics of beauty. You see with Alexander that the figure has a smaller head and longer legs and a more graceful body. And so the idea of a smaller head conveying a more heroic form and a more adult form, you learn this in any sort of basic drawing class today, that also dates from this period. The last slide now, if you move forward, we can see Hercules as a demigod. And we see him as this sort of massively muscled figure. And then on the same slide, you see the Apollo Belvedere depicted as the height of male beauty. And so kind of where we're getting to with Hellenism and the age of Alexander the Great that's reflected in these sculptures is an emphasis on extremes. And an emphasis on the individual and kind of the individual, but not really directed in terms of a well-rounded personality. So Hercules is only muscle, Apollo is only beauty. And so the kind of direction of excellence towards a higher end, an end outside of individual, the polis in most cases, that is evaporating. And remember, going right back to the first lecture, we talked about how that's typically a sign of a society that's in decline, even though the society is still able to do amazing things. So that's something that's important to keep in mind as we're going to be going forward, looking at the age of Alexander and then the Hellenistic era, how Greek society is changing. Lastly, here we're going to finish by talking about some painting and some pottery. Athens, the city of Athens, is most famous for developing pottery during this period. First style we see, as depicted on this slide, is black figures on a red background. Later style that we have with is red figures on a black background is more technically challenging, but it allows for a more precise image. So red figures on a black background, typically a sign of a later work and a more sophisticated pottery creator. And so we see these great images of Dionysus in a ship that's supposed to portray the sort of lyrical, poetic opulence of the god. You see Ajax and Achilles playing a board game during the Trojan War. It's just beautiful art that's being constructed at this time, and again reflects the success of Greek culture during this period. We're going to stop here and talk a little more about philosophy and literature in the next video.